And that Bible is a relic of a bygone era that no longer exists. That's what I kind of want to get to today is, okay, what things were like in the church before the deluge that happened in the 1960s. And starting in the immediate aftermath of World War II, which is a turning point in many ways. And what happens after World War II, generally across the Western world, especially in the United States, is there's a general post-war religious revival. There's an uptick, not just in the Catholic Church, but in other churches in Western Europe and the United States, of religious practice. Attendance at weekly services go up, membership goes up. You have, in the United States anyway, you have vocation levels shoot up after the war. Less so in Europe. This is something I'll come back to. There has been, since the late 19th century in Europe, a slow decline of attendance, membership, things like this. But in certain countries in Europe, France, UK, I know for a fact, you have a slight uptick. You have people coming back. You definitely have churches being built. You need them in Europe because they've had half of them destroyed. But there seems to be an uptick after the war. And in terms of what people's religious life was like before the war, I mean before Vatican II, before the 1960s, most people, if they lived in devout homes, would have had a rich devotional life. You would have things like family rosaries at night would have been a commonplace in devout homes. 40 hours devotion, stuff like this. Sunday evening benediction, these things would have been fairly commonplace if you grew up in that kind of home. This is the era in the 1950s of, I remember his first name, Father Peyton, and his Rosary Crusade. You know who he was? This is what's the phrase? The family that prays together stays together. That's him. He would go into, fill stadiums with these Rosary Crusades, not just in the United States, but also in the UK in the 1950s. So you do have this, really rich devotional life that's available to Catholics, which doesn't really exist, obviously, as much anymore. And in terms of parish life, things have been so different if you grew up in the immediate post-war era, especially because from the early 20th century, in the Anglophone world, United States, the UK, a lot of these parishes would be ethnic parishes because of immigration. United States, of course, late 19th century, early 20th century, there's a lot of immigration before it gets cut off by Congress in the 1920s. And also in Britain, because you have a bunch of Irish coming over to England in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so you have these very, very tight-knit parishes, as you do in Europe in many places. In places like the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, they have actually a term for this. It's called pillarization. And what that means is, historians, they talk about how Catholic communities sort of created their own little worlds of schools, of businesses, and stuff like this. And so where you lived in your parish, that was literally your world. Like, you knew everybody at work, went to the parish, everybody went to school, went to the parish school. There's another term for it that's less flattering. The term is ghetto. I'll come back to this in a moment, but this is the idea that it's a closed-off world. It's very narrow, it's very insular, but it's also one that really, it nourishes the faith. Sociologists of religion talk about plausibility structures for religious belief. What they mean is you get reinforcement every day. Every aspect of your life reinforces your faith in a way that, for reasons that will become apparent, they're actually changing during this period. It doesn't happen anymore. But for most people growing up in the 40s and 50s, that would have been more or less the default at the time. Same time, in the post-war, especially in the immediate post-war period, you do have Catholics in the States, in the UK, to lesser extent, but even Europe, becoming prominent in social and cultural life in a way they probably hadn't before in many decades. There is, in the post-war period, a literary revival going on, both in Anglophone world, definitely. We're talking about people like Graham Greene, the novelist, Flannery O'Connor in the States. I guess Tolkien is still writing. J.R.R. Tolkien, you must know who Tolkien is. He's writing in the post-war period. Even in France, I believe George Bernanos was another famous novelist. He lives till 1948 or so. François Mauriac wins the Nobel Prize in 1952. He's a Catholic novelist, devout Catholic. So they're coming into prominence there. Hollywood, of course, loves Catholics, at least in their films in the post-war period. This is the era of things like The Song of Bernadette. I want to say The Bells of St. Mary's before World War II, but there are all these, Quo Vadis, all these sword and sandal films, some of which are pitched in a sort of Catholic vein. And just in general, in post-war social life, even in places like France, where there had been a real conflict in the early part of the 20th century, if you don't know, they passed a law which separated church and state in 1905 in France. There was a lot of bitterness Catholics, come into their own even there. They have more social credibility than they had before. Even, and this only lasts for a few years after the war, even in Germany after the war, the church was seen to be one of the institutions that had actually stood up a little bit to Hitler. So it has a little more respectability than it did before the war as well. And also, the role of the priesthood in this period, it's again, I don't know what your experience is. I'm assuming it's nothing like this, but just to give you an idea of in what reverence priests were held in this period. I'm sure you all know who Alec Guinness was. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the actor who played Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. He's a convert to Catholicism. He converted in 1958, actually. And he tells a story in his memoirs about one of the things that led him to the church. He was filming a movie in France. Actually was playing Father Brown. This is G.K. Chesterton's detective. They were filming in a little village. And at the other end of the town, he had his hotel room near the train station. He walked into town to have a drink with the rest of the cast. As he left to go walk back to his hotel, a little French kid, a little 7 or 8-year-old boy, ran up to him because he had his, fake clericals on, and, started saying, "Mon père," grabbed his hand and started walking with him, right, all the way down to his hotel room, babbling in French the whole time. And he said he didn't say anything, his French was too bad to do that, but by the time the kid, "Bonsoir, mon père," went and left off that, he was a nominal Anglican before he became a Catholic, and he said one of his big hang-ups was he thought Catholic priests were creepy and scheming and crafty and stuff like this, and this sort of absolute sense of trust this little kid had to just come up and say hi and start talking like that. One of the things that led him to become Catholic later on. So that's just an anecdote just about the childlike almost, and this is not just for kids but adults. You take what your priest says almost absolutely on trust. This is still something very much a part of people's lives back then. The other thing that's very different about religious life in this post-war era revival that is very different today is the influence of bishops. I mean, social influence. Even in places like, again, Germany, not France as much, but places like the Netherlands, if a bishop came out against something, politically speaking, and told Catholic voters not to vote on it, they, for the most part, wouldn't vote. They'd vote against something. They definitely had this influence in the States because of immigration, and it was an immigrant church. But even in those European countries, they had that kind of authority, social authority. They also had, I don't know if anybody's seen the film, probably not, Hail Caesar, it was made a couple of years ago. This is a Coen Brothers movie. It's not that great, but it's about this, and the guy's a Catholic. The main character in the movie is a Catholic. He's a producer. He's trying to produce this film about the life of Christ. It's transparently based on Ben-Hur, by the way, if you don't know what that is. And the film actually begins with the guy in the confessional, by the way. It's very interesting. Anyway, in the movie, he has to go meet with a Catholic priest, a rabbi, an Orthodox priest, a Protestant minister to get to okay the film. And this is something that's realistic. Back in those days, if a Catholic, power from left Catholic prelate came out against the movie, Hollywood would just scuttle it. Probably some of you probably don't know who Cecil B. DeMille was. This is a major film. The Ten Commandments, right? The 1950s one with Charlton Heston. He did that one, did the early version of this. Great film. He actually, by the way, did a really, really interesting silent version of, The Life of Christ, which you should actually see. It's very interesting. He was an Anglican, a fairly devout one from what I understand. Had a very interesting personal life to Cecil B. DeMille. I'll leave it there. But he, at one point in his life, wanted to make a film about the Virgin Mary. But he didn't do it. Why? Because on the one hand, the evangelicals would hate it, but he also was afraid of what the Catholics would say about it. So bishops had an inordinate amount of influence, which, as Father Lockwood indicated in his talk, they just simply do not have that kind of social authority anymore for a variety of reasons. Besides the post-war religious revival, the other thing about what's happening in the church is it's already had been this, but it's becoming much more a global church than it had been before after the war for a variety of reasons. Partly because of the impetus of Pius XII, who was the Pope at the time. I see the book that's going around, the Bible. Partly because he's someone who had an international vision. In fact, when he becomes Pope in 1939, he appoints, I believe he's the first Pope to appoint indigenous bishops for Asia and Africa. And one of the things to note about the church prior to Vatican II, sometimes you get this you get defenders of the council saying things like, well, the explosion of the faith in Africa is due to the council, and this is totally false. The evangelization of Africa was actually undertaken by missionaries in the reign of Pius XI and Pius XII. Pius XII actually issued an encyclical in 1958 called Fidei Donum, talking about the church in Africa. And the church was actually kind of, in this sense, progressive in that era. They actually supported, African countries, for example, in their decolonization efforts. They were on the side of the faithful there. And so it's missionaries in that area who are really responsible for this. People, by the way, like Marcel Lefebvre, who was a missionary for 30 years in Africa. So this is one of the things, like I say, it's becoming more global in this regard. It's also becoming more global because it is engaging with, and then Father Lockwood mentioned this, a global fight against communism. Pius XII, from well before he became Pope, saw communism as the main threat in Europe and worldwide. Is the Vatican very much involved in efforts to defeat, for example, communist parties at the polls in the immediate post-war scene. In 1948, for example, there's a big election, the first election in Italy, and there's a big, powerful communist party. And they work together, we're not really sure how, with the Americans, the American government, to defeat them at the polls. We know the CIA, by the way, gave the Italians money. There was a guy, his name was James Angleton, whose contact in Italy was none other than Giovanni Battisti Montini, who would be, Paul VI later on. So they gave them lots of money. What they did with it, I don't know. But they managed to defeat the communists in several countries with the help of the Americans. And there was actually involvement elsewhere. In fact, the Vatican, I know, tries to influence, again, American policy in places like, for example, Vietnam. They're the ones who push for them to appoint, when they sort of unofficially take over in Vietnam, Syngman Rhee, he's the first president of South Vietnam. He's a Catholic. Vietnamese have been evangelized since the 18th century by the French, and so he comes from an old Catholic family. They have influence in that regard. He also, Pius XII does, and this is something, he was very anti-communist, but he was also a diplomat by training. He'd been the nuncio to Germany before World War II. And he had the Holy Office. This is the Holy Office, it's called the CDF now, but he had them issue a ruling in 1949, basically saying you could be excommunicated for being a member of the Communist Party. So this is probably the most proactive thing he ever did. He was, again, a very cautious guy for the most part, but they took this deadly seriously. And it's part of this engagement with modernity that Pius XII wanted to do in his reign. And in fact, broader, outside the Vatican, you also have efforts, and Pius was a part of this as well. Having been a nuncio to Germany, he actually spearheaded efforts to rebuild Germany after the war. He was very thankful, actually, for donations from America, where a lot of the money came from that he sent to these people in post-war Germany. But you also have efforts to rebuild the continent by Catholic politicians in this period. People like Konrad Adenauer, who became the first Chancellor of West Germany. Remember, after the war, Germany gets divided up between the Soviets and the Western powers. West Germany gets created, and Konrad Adenauer was a devout Catholic. He was I believe he was a Knight of Malta, one of these crusading orders or something like this. Great statesman, had been mayor of Cologne, opposed the Nazis before the Second World War. And he, along with several other Catholic politicians, Robert Schuman in France, Alcide Gaspari in Italy, who had a somewhat tense relationship with Pius XII, because Pius wasn't, the Catholic Party in Italy was called the Christian Democrats. I guess they're still there, but Pius wasn't necessarily on board with all the things he was doing, but he eventually listened to Gaspari. The point is, they helped build what's called Christian democracy in Europe in this period. They build essentially the foundations for the European Union, which doesn't sound like a great thing, maybe, but at the time it really was inspired by a Catholic ideal of sort of fraternity among nations and trying to rebuild things after the war. And these people deserve a lot of credit for this, these Catholic politicians, so they're prominent in doing this. Of course, the church is also suffering because of communism in the post-war era. Places like Hungary get taken over by the Soviets. You have, cardinals, lots of, prelates locked up, executed. I believe Cardinal Mincensi is the famous one who gets locked up and I believe dies in prison, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm getting this confused. In Poland, they just beatified the one in Poland who was put in prison there. I can't remember his name. Stefan I can't pronounce Polish names. I apologize. But Poland as well, of course, is taken over by the Soviets. In the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the Byzantines were in communion with Rome. Their church is officially liquidated in 1946 by Joseph Stalin. He has the Russian Catholic Church. They return them to the Russian Catholic Church, Russian Orthodox Church. And so it has to go underground for the next 45 years. As happens also in China after 1949 and the Communist Revolution there. So this is the reason why Pius XII is so insistent on this. And then finally, I'm going to mention briefly, in Latin America, you have, in the post-war period, you're going to have, I guess you will later on as well, the church facing problems with military regimes, okay? Because you have conservative regimes get overthrown, there's military juntas. So they're dealing with that sort of problem in the post-war period, as well as problems with regards to industrialization, which is kind of leads me to my next part of this talk, is all the social and economic changes that are going on in the 1940s and 50s that are actually going to sort of change things, that are actually at work even in the immediate post-war period, that are going to undermine, I say undermine, they're going to change that sort of very tight-knit sort of Catholic world focus on the parish. And the first of these, again, Father Rockwood's already hinted at this, is the baby boom. As there is a religious revival after the war, there's also a baby boom. Again, the United States is the sort of headwaters for this, but pretty much in every Western nation as well, you have an uptick in births. This happens when people anticipate good times happening. They have kids, they think they have the money for it. This is pretty much to be expected. But one of the things, you may have heard the phrase demography is destiny. What this does, this big spike in births between 45 and say 1960, is it means you just have a lot more people in that generation. It means you have numbers so that when they grow up, they can impose their will on people because there's just more people in the pipeline, which is part of what explains what happens in the 1960s. The other thing that happens to change things in the 1960s is post-war affluence. Things recover pretty quickly. In America, of course, almost overnight, because we went from a wartime footing to turn that into what became, America was the Colossus, in an unprecedented way. By the end of the 1940s, one historian estimates that 42% of the world's income was American. 42%. And yes, if you're wondering, by the way, that is more than any other empire, entity in human history, which, by the way, was never going to last. The reason for that is half the world's economy lay in ruin because of war. But it meant that America, for about 10 years, there were no two superpowers. There was one. So that makes people feel good. But this also happens in Europe. By the middle of the 1950s, and sometimes you hear historians talk about this, they'll talk about the Western Miracle, they'll talk about the 30 glorious years in France. By the mid-1950s, there's a revival underway in these places. So you have people, with the help of American aid, by the way, the Marshall Plan, as well as the United States footing the bill for their defense. They can spend money on social welfare programs. But pretty much within a few years, there's already people, things like, definitely in America, TV sets becoming common in homes. This takes place a little bit later in France. Most people, even by 1960 in France, don't have telephones in their home, but by the end of the 60s they do. But again, all the sort of convenience items, vacuum cleaners, refrigerator people didn't have, they're all having now. You laugh, but it makes a big difference in the way people live their lives. They're more comfortable, which changes the way they live and think. Another thing that happens, and I mentioned these economic changes would have happened anyway, one way or the other. Another is suburbanization. Again, people are buying cars in the post-war period. People are leaving those inner city parishes and going out to suburbs. They're just more mobile than they used to be, right? And it's a great thing to have all those, that world unto itself, but maybe you don't like your in-laws, you can get the hell away from them and go out to the suburbs and all those sorts of things. And so this is undermining, again, the integrity of the parish as well. Another thing that's undermining this in the long run will be the fact that, again, you have a lot of kids. You'll have a big expansion of education in the post-war period. Again, the United States is the biggest expansion, but pretty much everywhere in Europe, at least if you're in the middle classes, you have more and more people going to universities. By the mid-1960s in France, they almost will have room, literally, for all the students they have, which means, of course, they're being exposed more and more to secular ideas. So this is something in the back of my mind. And it's partly because of this uptick in affluence, this uptick in baby boom, that you begin to get, and it's uptick in social respectability that comes out of the war. You begin to get talk in the 1950s about leaving the Catholic ghetto. And this is actually a famous essay written by, I remember his first name, I think it's John Tracy Ellis. He's a theologian at Notre Dame. Wrote an article, I don't remember the title, in 1955, basically accusing American Catholics of being anti-intellectual. They're not open, they don't know the best of secular thought, they're not open to the world and all this stuff. They need to leave their Catholic ghetto and go out into the world, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot, and that if you read that article, I mention it because he's very concerned what secular universities think of Catholic universities. He's very concerned that they don't seem to match up with what secular universities are doing. There is this really intense desire for acceptance from the world outside of, your Catholic parish, basically, in the 1950s. Among which is that there's a desire for better relationships with other religious faiths, particularly Protestants, especially in the States. I had, I remember hearing a talk from a former Anglican minister who became a Catholic priest before the Second Vatican Council, talking about how he taught at an Episcopal school up in New York City in the 1950s, and he had a counterpart down the road who was at a Catholic school, and they would actually sometimes see each other with their classes going down the street. They would never even look at each other or talk to each other, right? Very frozen. After the post-war period, when people are all becoming more affluent, there's being less and less social distinctions, they want to have more open relationships. So this is part of the social winds of change. The other thing that's actually a part of the change itself, and I have to mention this, it's not technically post-war, but it's the war itself. The war itself undermines, I think, the solidity of the parish. Why? Because you have men going off to boot camp and going halfway across the country and being exposed to people of different faiths, different ethnicities, different backgrounds in ways they would not have otherwise. You have, just exposure in that regard. In the United States, for example, in some places you have wives go with their husbands, like they may go from the East Coast to the West Coast for basic training and stay there. There's migrations all across the country. So this is going to undermine, in some ways, the effects of what had been a fairly solid, Catholic world. You also have other undercurrents in the church. I'll call undercurrents of, I don't know how to put this, dissatisfaction or other things in the church. I won't go over these too much, partly because Father mentioned some of them before the Second Vatican Council. Starting in the 1940s, there were people that were discontented with the way theology was taught in seminaries. He mentioned they're usually grouped together called the Nouvelle Theologie. So there are challenges to the reigning Thomistic way of training people in the seminary and teaching the faith. There's also a lot of talk about something called the new morality in certain circles in the 1950s. And what the new morality amounts to basically is moral relativism. I mention this only because one of the proponents of this stuff, even before the Second Vatican Council, is a theologian named Bernard Haring, if you know this name. This is someone who becomes one of the leading opponents of Humanae Vitae in the 1960s, once the church changed its teaching on contraception. He is also, if you don't recall this, Pope Francis has said several times this is his favorite moral theologian. So you already have this stuff in the pipeline well before the war. You also have attempts to, among theologians, to get the church to alter its teachings on relationships between church and state. There are a couple of people, I'll mention them here. Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher, ambassador to the Holy See at one point, as a Thomist, but he kind of publishes several books in which he basically wants, and he's thinking of the experience of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy and the experience of post-war era, wants the church to basically go all in on democracy, on secular democracy, to embrace ideas of separation of church and state. But maybe a more influential figure there, perhaps, is John Courtney Murray, an American Jesuit at Georgetown, who spends the better part of a decade. He's actually put under some suspicion by Rome at some point. I should mention that, Father didn't mention this. Several of those Nouvelle theologians at certain points are censured or otherwise sort of silenced by Rome at some point in the late 1940s and 1950s. Pius XII actually issued an encyclical criticizing and condemning some of the tendencies of those thinkers in 1950 called Humani Generis. So there's serious fighting about this. But I mentioned John Courtney Murray because he has this almost 10-year back and forth with other theologians in the American church about this. And in fact, there was a book written about 5 or 6 years ago, and I can't remember the guy's name. I can't remember the title of the book, but it's an interesting book. But he argues that, in fact, he says he has documentation that John Courtney Murray was actually a CIA asset, that he actually had a contact at the CIA, because if you don't know, the CIA was in everything in the Cold War. I mean, literally, I'll give you an example. What he's claiming is that the CIA was trying to get theologians to embrace American-style religious liberty for Cold War purposes. Again, they were thinking of what's going on in the Soviet Union. Yes, sir.
David Wimenoff.
David Wimenoff, that's the guy, yeah. And I say this because a few years ago, I don't think I would have listened to this and thought it as a conspiracy theory. It sounds very plausible to me, actually. If you don't know, the CIA had a massive program where they funded novelists and writers. They actually published their own books. They got people like, I don't know who Vladimir Nabokov was. Vladimir Nabokov was a huge literary figure. They were producing propaganda for them, the CIA in the 19th. There's a whole book about it about 20, 30 years ago. I can't remember the name of it. Would not surprise me at all if they were actually trying to do this. I do know for a fact that the Truman administration wanted to use the World Council of Churches. You know what this is? This is a liberal, sort of liberal Protestant ecumenical organization. In the 1950s, they tried to influence them. The Soviets got to them first, and they became a front for the Soviets in the 1970s. So they were definitely interested in pushing that. And so I say this because John Courtney Murray basically is the person who's going to be influential at the Second Vatican Council, helped drafting their Declaration on Religious Liberty. So it's a fascinating thing to think about. Other things you also have that are going on, undercurrents of discontent. You also have liturgical reform under Pius XII, which, if you don't know, I won't go through this too much, because you may know more about this than I do, but there was a reform of Holy Week ceremonies in 1955 by a committee formed by Pius XII. And in fact, I won't go into too much detail, this came out of the concerns of the so-called liturgical movement. This goes back to the pre-World War I era. And in fact, the original founders of that movement actually had a good intention to sort of get people to understand and get more out of the actual liturgy. Something went wrong in the post-war period I'm not aware of, but they began to get a lot of weird ideas, and it kind of went off the rails in the 1950s. But that's going on at this time period. There's also a long-standing problem that long predates any of this. There's also concerns about Catholics in the working class. And the reason that is because ever since Western society has industrialized in the 19th century, basically religion in general in the Western world is middle class. The working classes tend to abandon it. And I mention this because in France, you have a bunch of priests who try to do something about this. They form what's called the worker priest movement. They actually go into factories in Paris and other places and try to minister to workers. I actually have some sympathy with it because I have sympathy with the working classes, but it really quickly becomes a political program. It gets captured by commies, naturally. But eventually it gets to a point where Pius XII has to actually shut down the movement. But this is a long-term problem. The church is run by and for a single class with its interests, with its understanding of the world. And I think it is a problem. It cuts us all. I mean, most priests I know, again, in most parishes, I don't think they could talk intelligibly to someone who, is a plumber or a carpenter. Or my father owned a lawn maintenance business. I went to graduate school, but he was, my father would have nothing to do with most priests because they don't know how to talk to them. They know people who have 12 degrees like me, so. And so I'm part of the problem. So you have those undercurrents. You also have an undercurrent, I mentioned this earlier, there was an uptick in the early part of the post-war period. In Europe, of course, it doesn't last. In fact, it doesn't last actually in the States. By the end of the 1950s, you do have starting to have decline, even in the United States, although it peaks. Weekly mass attendance peaks in the United States in 1958, same date as the Bible, at 74%. Amazing. But it's already beginning to sort of dip earlier and faster in Europe. And you might not notice that if you were a devout parishioner in Europe. The bishops notice it. They're very, very aware of it. They're definitely aware of falling vocations in Europe. And I mention this because I think, what Father kind of alluded to in his talk is that a lot of what happens at Vatican II, I think, is pushed by Europeans. European bishops were concerned about their church, and I think they're pushing what they think are remedies for their problems, I think, at the council more than anything else. Another problem that sometimes the pre-Vatican II church gets accused of is especially the Vatican itself, is being authoritarian. That is, its governance is somehow overly harsh. And I mention this partly because I used to think this was a kind of a liberal, progressive Catholic myth. And in some ways it is. Some ways it's just fun to blame everything on the pre-Vatican II church. In some ways, however, I think that's actually correct. They could be really harsh in the way they discipline theologians. I mentioned some of those Nouvelle theologians who, don't get me wrong, I think their ideas, they're right to be suspicious of. They could sometimes deal with them in a really, I don't think they were the best way to deal with them. One of the big things that's actually wrong with the way the church worked, and still works actually, is they could be really, really secretive. In particular, there's this mentality. I'll give you an example of this. The bishops of the UK in 1960 hired a statistician to do a report on how Irish immigrants were integrating into the church in the UK. Well, he did the report, and it turns out they weren't integrating in the church. They were leaving. And the bishops didn't like it, so they leaned on the statistician. He never published it. And this is something I think it's a part of a pattern long predates the council of simply not wanting to face up to hard realities, of shooting the messenger, of telling people that things are going wrong and not wanting to hear it. And I say this because I have to bring this back to something else that also begins in the immediate post-war period. Ugly though it is to talk about it, and that's the sexual abuse crisis. We all know this spikes in the 1960s and 70s. We all know the role that the sexual revolution plays in that. But it actually begins in most countries almost as soon as the war ends. States, the first cases start in 45, Germany in 1946, Netherlands and Belgium in 1945 or so. A little later, 50s, I think, in France, 1950s in Poland. We don't know about Italy, by the way, because I just found this out. They don't actually keep records of children who've been molested by priests, which is a terrible thing. I'm assuming, by the way, that's because of the influence of the Vatican. But there is this sense of not being able to face up to things. And I say all that because, of course, what's going to happen, as you'll see in the 1960s, is Catholic attitudes of lay people anyway are beginning to change towards sex. And one of the things besides sexual abuse, obviously, is probably playing into this, I'll go back to the war. Because again, when you have the war, you send guys off to boot camp, you send them off to war. One of the things they have access to they didn't have back home is recreational sex. Prostitutes are a part of warfare, unfortunately. Even military wives, husbands are gone. Think of Britain, right? British war wives, war brides. Some of them didn't get married, even though they were already, So there's all that sort of undermining of things probably had an effect as well. And we know, I don't have stats for World War II, but we know that, for example, in France, after World War I, which was devastating enough, rates of venereal disease, contraction of it went way up after World War I. Rates of births out of wedlock went way up after World War I. So this probably had an effect of breaking down barriers about sexuality. Among the generation, by the way, that raised the baby boomers, that's one thing to keep in mind here. They already probably brought some of this back, is one of the things that you should probably keep in mind. And of course, the last thing I'll mention is the pill, which in 1960 is invented, and that's already on the cusp of the council itself as well. And so all of these trends kind of come to fruition at the end of the 1950s, when you have a change in the pontificate, finally. In 1958, Pius XII dies in 1958, and John the 23rd is elected. And all of these things he comes to symbolize a lot of this later on. Catholic social aspirations, desire for better relationships with other religions, but also the influence of those theologians, the ones who had challenged church teaching earlier. They all get rehabilitated by the time he becomes Pope. Again, within a few years being disciplined, they're now having really serious influence on the church. And in fact, when he's elected, if you don't know about John the 23rd, he was supposed to be a caretaker. He was like in his late 70s. He was pretty old, and he didn't live that long. But as soon as he gets into the chair, he does start making changes. One of the first things he does, actually, in 1958 when he's elected, is he enlarges the College of Cardinals. Up until then, Pius V in 1570 had issued a law that it should not exceed 70 bishops. He gets rid of that, so there's no more limit after that, and he makes, I think, like 17 new cardinals, so he enlarges the nature of the college. And of course, most famously, he calls for a council. which it's true enough. I tend to agree with Father that it shouldn't have been called. There was talk of calling a council, however. Going back to Pius XI, there was talk about calling a council, mainly to finish the work of the First Vatican Council, which ended prematurely. If you don't know, that was held in 1870. Italy was being overrun by the new Italian state. They were taking over Rome, and they didn't finish what they had started. And there was some sense of wanting to do this. I think Pius XI and XII wisely held off on it, obviously. But he does other things almost immediately. By 1960, he has called for a commission to revise canon law. And he creates in 1960 this Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity. So this idea of ecumenism, which again, it predates World War II actually. There are people pushing for this, wanting to have better relationships with other religions, but also, as you can see there, wanting to try to gain reunion. And I say all this you look at his teaching, if you go take a look at his encyclicals, for the most part, it seems fairly traditional when you read his encyclicals. To give you an example, one of the last ones he published, I don't have the date here, but he published an encyclical on penitence, Penitentiam Agere, in which he said, talking about the coming council, because it's already been called for, he says Vatican II will, quote, be publicly, the task of Vatican II will be, quote, publicly to reaffirm God's rights over mankind, whom Christ's blood has redeemed, and to reaffirm the duties of redeemed mankind toward its God and Savior, unquote. Not exactly how the council turned out, as it turns out. And in fact, up until the council meets, he's issuing documents like Veterum et Sapientia. If you know that this is an apostolic constitution, he issued in 1962, calling for more intensive study of Latin in seminaries. So again, what you're seeing probably is a struggle in the Curia, because I'm assuming he doesn't write any of these himself. John the 23rd was not an intellectual. And so what you have is seemingly is this, most of his advisors are pretty traditional. What's going to change, of course, is by the time the council opens in 1962, it seems like those theologians that had been rehabilitated, that had been wanted to challenge things earlier, they seem to have won the day, because his opening speech to the council sounds very different. And he was an optimistic person anyway. He'd always been optimistic, but it's full of optimism, talking about the church needing to open its windows, talking about the church needing to update the faith and all this stuff. And so you kind of have, at the end of this period, where I guess in some ways it makes sense. There's all this uptick in your material life. There's all this uptick in, hey, Catholics are being taken seriously by the wider world. Isn't that a good thing? Which feeds into a sense of optimism that informs the council, and which I think, obviously I agree with Father about this, it was a naive sense of optimism in a lot of ways. And I come back just to end all this. I was thinking about this when I presented all this stuff to you. You sometimes get, again, these debates about what the church was like before the council, and it was the absolute pillar. It was the greatest time in the church's history. It was the worst time, right? And in fact, there's truth in both of those claims. There's a lot of light in the pre-Vatican II church. The reverence for the priesthood, the devotional life, I think all of you who love the Latin Mass appreciate, right? Which is no longer there. The fact that you have those, quote unquote, plausibility structures, that you have reinforcement for your faith. One of the things, of course, we all, if you're faithful, you struggle with today, is you have reinforced 24/7 around you is the total opposite. And that's something I think everybody, if they're honest, would say, okay, it may have had its problems. That's what you need to live out the faith. You can't live the faith alone. You cannot. I know I've tried. But you also have the spread of the faith to Africa. You have the spread of the faith to Asia. You have the fight against communism. All these good things you can take away from it. On the other hand, of course, there is darkness as well. I didn't mention it, but Father alluded to it. What you have in some of these Nouvelle theologians, they want to go back and pick up certain theses of the modernists of the early 20th century and try to pick them out of the modernists' larger context and see if they can't insert them into church teaching. This, of course, is a dangerous thing. The failure of the working classes continuously to appeal to a large body of people that have left the church. That's obviously a bad thing. And of course, sexual abuse. The beginnings of it in this period. We can't really separate that. Again, I don't want to soft pedal what happened in the 60s and 70s. There were things there that made it so much worse. But it was already there. And then I think about this as well because, if you don't know, I'm not a Latin Mass goer. I'm actually a member of the Ordinary of the Chair of St. Peter. But as I've become more and more traditional in my thinking, one of the things you wonder about is, why can't you criticize the Second Vatican Council? I'm not talking about theologically or anything like that. Why can't you even say, well, maybe it didn't work? If you say that out loud, you'll be accused of, if you doubt the council, you're doubting the church's authority, why can't you even say anything about it? This inability to say anything but happy thoughts about what happened in the 60s. And I thought, well, that must be this, this post-Vatican II modernist thing. But in fact, of course, the church had the same problem before the council. There were already things they couldn't. It's bad when you can't own up to harsh realities. That's what I loved about Father's talk, actually, is that he talked about hard things to you. Like, you cannot ignore things like that. And it's not, look, I know dissenters are horrible to the church's teaching, but sometimes people not every criticism is a dissent. Not every, and I know, and I say this because this isn't limited to the church, of course. Look at your political leaders. They simply, I never thought I'd see the day when a president would walk away from questions like he does, the current one, at a press conference. Just not answer things in the most, perfunctory way. But this seems to be, I'm a Gen Xer, by the way, so it's not my fault. I'm not a baby boomer, but there does seem to be a certain pattern among leadership that came to power in the 1960s that doesn't want to have to answer for anything. And I think this is, again, looking back at the pre-Vatican II church, you can see what was lost, and it should make you sad in some ways, because those things were good. But as always, as there is today, there is darkness and light. And you guys, in some ways, you're here, you're faithful, you're adhering to the traditional Mass, you are part of the light. That doesn't mean, I think, going forward in the future, you can't look away from the darkness. You're going to have to look at it and confront it, even as you try to adhere to those good things that God's given you. All right, that is it.